Joseph was 17 years old when he had those two dreams where sheaves of grain were bowing down to him, and the sun, moon, and 11 stars were bowing down to him. After this, he was absolutely hated by his brothers, who then tried to kill him, but then they ended up selling him for 20 shekels of silver. Joseph was then taken to Egypt, was sold to Potiphar, an Egyptian government official, and he worked for him. And Joseph was put in charge of everything there, and Joseph did a wonderful job as the Lord was with him. The Lord blessed the household of Potiphar, a secular person, because of Joseph. But then Joseph was falsely accused by Mrs. Potiphar and put into prison, where again he was given the work of attending government officials, the chief cupbearer and the chief baker. After ministering to them by interpreting their dreams, Joseph asked the cupbearer to mention him to Pharaoh. What happened? Well, the cupbearer forgot him. And this is how Genesis 40 ends. Now, it's been 11 years since he was taken captive. 11 years since the first two dreams. 11 years of slavery and imprisonment. 11 years of schooling. By the way, do you remember the last Sunday's sermon by PG where the three schools that Joseph went through during these 11 years? Can anyone remember? It's a school of anybody? There are three schools. School of Electrical Engineering? No. School of Spatial Environment? No. School of Hardship? Yes. And the School of Service. And the last one, School of Waiting. School of Waiting. Yeah. But God was not absent from him. In fact, God was very present, working on him all these years. And now we come to Genesis 41, where there is a drastic change in Joseph's circumstances. The first point. But notice that this chapter opens with, when 2 years had fully passed. You may ask, what? 2 more years? Yes, 2 more years. 2 more years in the prison. For the whole 2 years, the cupbearer forgot about Joseph. This sounds frustrating. As if 11 years was not long enough. As if 11 years was not devastating enough. For Joseph, the last 11 years were for sure a long and challenging time. It was not just challenging, but perhaps even traumatic. His own brothers hated him and tried to kill him. They ended up selling him for 20 shekels of silver. Can you imagine the sense of abandonment, the sense of rejection, and the depth of sorrow? Can you imagine the kind of inner struggles that Joseph could have undergone at that time and even afterward, living a life of slave and a prisoner? When Joseph later on had 2 children in Egypt, he named his first one Manasseh, which means forget. Joseph said he gave his first child this name because God has made me forget all about my trouble and all my father's household. And he names his second child Ephraim, meaning God has made me fruitful in the land of my suffering. This suggests that Joseph's inner struggles were real. The sufferings were real. And 2 more years, that would make 13 years altogether in the schools of hardship, service, and waiting, from age 17 to age 30. So if you think about your age entering Handong, international age 19. That would make you age 32 by the time you graduate. We can guess that there were many times during those 13 years that Joseph was challenged with depression, with anger, with resentfulness. But the last 2 years must have been especially challenging. Would Joseph still have believed in the dreams that he had 13 years ago? Would he still have believed that God keeps his words? Would he still believe that God is alive at all? In chapter 41, we finally see that God's timing is perfect. God does not waste his time. When the Kairos time came, God spoke to Pharaoh through dreams. And that is when the chief cupbearer remembers Joseph. If the cupbearer had remembered Joseph earlier and spoken to Pharaoh earlier, would Pharaoh then have done anything to Joseph, for Joseph? Most likely not. It was because Pharaoh had those 2 disturbing dreams of 7 ugly cows eating up the other 7 cows, and 7 healthy heads of grain devouring, swallowing up 7 thin heads of grain, that he wanted to see Joseph. Furthermore, what would have happened if Joseph had not been falsely accused by Mrs. Potiphar? If Joseph had not been falsely accused, he would not have been put in jail. If he had not been in jail, Joseph would not have met the chief cupbearer. If Joseph had not met the cupbearer, he wouldn't have been able to be at the palace at the request of Pharaoh. You see that every little detail led Joseph to be in charge of the whole land of Egypt. Every little detail. And that is not the end of the story. Because Joseph was now in charge of Egypt, we see that not only Egypt, but all nations surrounding Egypt were saved. They were basically saved because of Joseph. And most importantly, because Joseph was in the right place at the right time, Israel was sustained. Israel was saved. And it was through Israel that Messiah came to save all nations. We realize that God was in the midst of all the details, even those details that seem like failures or bad luck. God was there all along. God was present. God was sovereign. We come to chapter 41 and realize that this is no longer just Joseph's story, but it is God's story. God's story for humanity, for Egypt, for Israel, and for all nations. God's story of salvation. And this story began long before the birth of Joseph. God's story of salvation began right after the fall of man. And that story was more specifically revealed to Abraham in Genesis 12. If we could show Genesis 12:3, God says, all peoples on earth will be blessed through you. Let's say this together. All peoples on earth will be blessed through you. Through Abraham's lineage, Joseph came, foreshadowing the coming Messiah. And eventually Christ came. The Christ came through this lineage. It is Joseph's story but it is more than Joseph's story. It is in fact God's story. Do you recognize God's story in the midst of your stories? Second point, not I, but God. Our question would be, did Joseph recognize it is in fact God's story? I don't know. But there are many places that would actually lead us to believe that he was constantly aware of God in the midst of his sufferings. He was God-focused. Joseph worked hard in Potiphar's household with integrity. This, in a way, demonstrates that Joseph was keenly aware of God. We know that in Colossians chapter 3, verse 23 and 24, we read, "Whatever you do, work at it with all your heart as working for the Lord, not for human masters." Let me say that again. Whatever you do, work at it with all your heart as working for the Lord, not for human masters. See how hard work has spiritual significance. I believe Joseph worked hard with all his heart in Potiphar's household, a secular workplace, because he was keenly aware of God. Later in the prison, when Joseph heard that the chief cupbearer and the chief baker had dreams, he said this. He said, "Do not interpretations belong to God? Tell me your dreams." Don't interpretations belong to God? Tell me your dreams. Joseph was fully aware that God was present and that God spoke. When he was taken from the pit, from the dungeon to the palace overnight, he did not change. He remained the same. When Pharaoh, the most powerful man in the most powerful empire, asked Joseph, "I've heard that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it." What did Joseph say? He did not melt before him, nor did he shyly accept Pharaoh's compliment in a courteous way. Any Korean would do something like "아이고, 멀려." Don't mention it. And sort of accept his compliment. But he remained God-focused. He said, "I cannot do it. But God will give Pharaoh the answer he desires." I cannot do it. He emphatically said, "Not I." He then directed Pharaoh's attention away from himself to God, saying, "But God." Not I, but God. God will give you a favorable answer. Not I, but God. Joseph was aware that God was there with him. Joseph was aware of God and focused on God. Third point, not Pharaoh, but God. God interprets dreams, but God is much more than a dream interpreter. God is in fact in charge of history. Joseph repeatedly said this very message to Pharaoh. Pharaoh, the very powerful person, he was regarded as God incarnate. Verse 25, God has revealed to Pharaoh what he is about to do. God has revealed, but God is going to do that. So God is the revealer. God speaks, but God is going to do it. 28, God has shown Pharaoh what he is about to do. Verse 32, the reason the dream was given to Pharaoh in two forms is that the matter has been firmly decided by who? Decided by God. And God will do it soon. How much courage would you need to be able to say things like that in front of the emperor? And Joseph was transferred from the dungeon, from the prison. He was standing in front of the most powerful person in the whole world, and said this, God is going to do it. In fact, the whole narrative of Genesis 42 is presented in such a way that the future of Egypt was established without any reference to Pharaoh. Pharaoh had no part in it except for having the dreams. A well-known Old Testament scholar, Walter Brueggemann, said this: "The future in Egypt does not depend upon Pharaoh. He does not get to decide. Pharaoh does not get to decide. In fact, Pharaoh is irrelevant and marginal to the future of the kingdom. Joseph has calmly but surely announced to the Lord of Egypt, Pharaoh, that the future is out of his hands. In Genesis 41, it is clear that Pharaoh can cause no future, nor can he resist the future that God will bring." A consistent message throughout the whole Bible is that kings of the world do not make history. The empires of the world do not determine the course of our lives, but God does. In fact, God even uses kings, including pagan kings, to effect history. In Isaiah 45, for example, verses 44 to 7, the Lord explains that the pagan King Cyrus was brought to power to bring about God's purposes for his people. Let me read verses 4 to 7. "For the sake of my servant Jacob and Israel my chosen, I call you by your name. I name you," and notice this, "though you do not know me." This is King Cyrus, a secular king. "You do not know me, but for the sake of my people, I call you. I am the Lord, and there is no other. Besides me, there is no God. I equip you, though you do not know me, that people may know you from the rising of the sun and from the west. There is none besides me. I am the Lord, and there is no other. I form light and create darkness. I make well-being and create calamity. I am the Lord who does all these things." Amen. Kings do not make history. They only serve history. In John chapter 19, we see Jesus in front of Pilate. Pilate wanted to release Jesus, in fact, as he found no basis for a charge against him. But the Jews was railing against him. So Pilate asked Jesus, "Where do you come from?" Trying to discern whether or not Jesus, in fact, would claim to be the Son of God. And what did Jesus do? Jesus said nothing. He remained silent. And this is what Pilate said: "Do you refuse to speak to me? Don't you realize that I have power either to free you or to kill you, to crucify you?" And this is what Jesus said to him. It's remarkable. I can only say, "Yay," after that. And Jesus said this: "You would have no power over me if it were not given to you from above." Let's say this verse together. You would have no power over me if it were not given to you from above. Genesis 41 speaks of the same message. Let me go back. The powers of this world, the political, economic, technological empires of this world are in fact great. And they may look like they are the ultimate movers and shakers of the world, controlling the courses of our history. They seem even intimidating. Many times, these powers even ignore and disdain God. But in Psalm 2, we hear God saying to these kings, these powers that come against God. Psalm 2, it says, God, the one enthroned in heaven, laughs. Do you hear that? He laughs. The Lord scoffs at them. He rebukes them in his anger and terrifies them in his wrath, saying, I have installed my king on Zion, on my holy mountain. the God of the universe, the God of creation, laughs at the kings of this world. Genesis 41 speaks of the same message. God, not Pharaoh, is in control. Not Pharaoh, but God. Sometimes we give too much credit to the pharaohs around us, the superpowers of the world. I think we need to be sensitive to them and pray for them, love them, but they are not our kings, the ultimate kings. Sometimes we give too much credit to those mini pharaohs around us, those people who are over us, those people who influence us. All powers, all authorities are under the rule of God. Perhaps our daily anxieties may stem from, our daily anxieties stem from many different sources, but perhaps the deepest root of our anxieties could be our lack of faith in the sovereignty of God. We may be gripped with worries and anxieties, most fundamentally because we do not believe that God is, in fact, in control. Not Pharaoh, but God. Fourth point, school of worship. So there was a drastic change in Joseph's life. Joseph was promoted from prison to palace even within a single day. But the sudden promotion did not corrupt him. He remained unchanged. He remained faithful. Joseph was only 30 years old when he became Pharaoh's second in command. But unlike many people we see today, the honor, the glory, and the prestige, the power did not corrupt him. In verse 38 and 39, we hear Pharaoh saying, "Can we find anyone like this man, one in whom is the Spirit of God? Since God has made all this known to you, there is no one so discerning and wise as you." Even Pharaoh acknowledged it is God who gave Joseph with such wisdom and knowledge. Then Pharaoh gave his own signet ring. He took it off and gave it to Joseph. Pharaoh's signet ring is used to sign important documents. So it represents authority, power to make decisions. Pharaoh gave Joseph fine robes and a gold chain which represent his highest position. When Joseph was paraded through the streets of Egypt, people shouted, "Make way, bow down." Pharaoh placed Joseph in charge of the whole Egypt. He said, verse 41, "I hereby put you in charge of the whole land of Egypt." Verse 44, "I am Pharaoh, but without your word, no one will lift hand or foot in all Egypt." Joseph was at the top of the world. He was given an Egyptian wife of a prestigious family. He had everything. But he did not succumb to the splendor of the Egyptian empire. He remained faithful. He remained faithful to God. He worshiped God. Perhaps this was the last phase of Joseph's leadership school, namely school of worship. In this school, you are given the ultimate test. The test is designed to see your true object of worship. Who or what it is that you actually worship. Who do you worship? Who do you serve? Who is your actual master? When you're given a sudden promotion to the top of the world, the splendor of powers and prestige are not the only things that you see. You get to see your own heart. You get to see what it is that you truly serve. You get to see what is or who is truly your God. It's a school of worship. Before his public ministry, Jesus was given 3 tests in the wilderness. And the final test was a test of worship. Yes, even Jesus was given the test on the subject of worship. Matthew 4:8-9. Again, the devil took him to a very high mountain and showed him all the kingdoms of the world and their splendor. And the devil says, all this I will give you if you will bow down and worship me. Hear that? The devil had guts. If you bow down and worship me, I'll give everything to you. He showed what? All the kingdoms of this world and their splendor. The ultimate test, I believe, is a test of worship. Who do you serve? Who is your actual master? What do people say when they see you live? Oh, he's a Jesus worshiper. It's actually hard to give that kind of a test when you're here in a very beautiful worship place. But the test will come to you, come to us, when we get to see the splendors of this world, the powers and the prestige. Joseph was given this test before his ministry, before his service to the world. In the same way, Jesus was given the test before his public ministry. It is only reasonable to expect, for us to expect, that we will also be given the test of worship before our ministries. The last point. God speaks and God lives. This is a name that was given to Joseph. He was given an Egyptian name, Zaphenath Paneah. Zaphenath Paneah. That's an anglicized pronunciation of Egyptian name that we don't know how to pronounce, which is generally understood to mean God speaks and God lives. Although it is an Egyptian name, possibly given to him in order to Egyptianize Joseph. He was given an Egyptian wife. He was given Egyptian position. He was given an Egyptian name. Pharaoh was trying to make him an Egyptian person. But in a strange way, God's sovereignty was still there. Joseph's new name, nevertheless, captures his life in a profound way. His whole life, I believe, was in fact a testimony of God who speaks, testimony of God who lives. Joseph experienced God's word throughout his life. God spoke to him in dreams. God spoke to him to interpret the dreams for the cupbearer and the baker and even Pharaoh. Joseph experienced God speaking to humans. Why would God of creation, speak to humans? Why would he care to speak to us? We know that God speaks to us because he is personal. The infinite God, the sovereign God, God of creation, he is personal. He speaks to us. And that's what Joseph experienced, and that's what Joseph demonstrated through his life. Now Joseph, who embraced and experienced and obeyed God's word, has now become himself a man of his word. Joseph himself gave words to Pharaoh. A man who was in prison in the morning, now standing in front of Pharaoh, were giving Pharaoh his words. Verse 33 and on. And now let Pharaoh look for a discerning and wise man and put him in charge of the land of Egypt. He was giving a managerial advice. Let Pharaoh appoint commissioners over the land to take a fifth of the harvest of Egypt during the 7 years of abundance. 35, they should collect all the food of these good years and that are coming and store up the grain under the authority of Pharaoh to be kept in the cities for food. Verse 36, this food should be held in reserve for the country to be used during the 7 years of famine that will come upon Egypt, so that the country may not be ruined by the famine. And it's remarkable to see that Pharaoh even acknowledged the weight of Joseph's word. 44, I am Pharaoh, but without your word, no one will lift hand or foot in all Egypt. Verse 55, then Pharaoh told all the Egyptians, go to Joseph and do what he tells you. God's word is active and alive. God's word is not dead, nor is it passive. It does not stagnate. The word of God, which is alive and active, goes together with God who lives. Our God lives. God speaks and God lives. God acts. God works. He's a speaker. He's an doer. He's an actor. Remember again what Joseph said to Pharaoh. God has revealed to Pharaoh what he's about to do. God has shown Pharaoh what he's about to do. Joseph lived his life demonstrating God who acts. God rules. God acts. God acted in the life of Joseph. God was not absent. He was at his work. You know, a common misconception of God is that we sometimes think God is sort of sitting out there on the throne just making decisions. But God that is portrayed in the Bible is God at work. Even from the first chapter of Genesis, when he was creating the universe, the Bible uses the word, after 6 days of work, God worked and he rested. Now, how revolutionary this could be when it was first presented to the Middle Eastern people. Gods that they served there did not work. In fact, to be God actually means that you don't work. The lowlies are supposed to work for you. Even among the humans, the people who are at a lower ranks, they must work. They do the labors. And if you become mature, if you become more like God, you don't work. You just think. You just reason. You just debate. And people thought that you're attaining the measure of God by not working. But God, presented in the Bible, worked. He does not slumber, nor does he sleep. He worked. He works. Jesus said, because my Father is at work, I too work. 아버지께서 일하시니 나도 일한다. God works. God acts. And that's what Joseph demonstrated. God who acts calls us to action. We need to listen to his word. We need to stay calm and listen to him. But we also need to act. We need to live because God is alive. God who created the universe called us to participate in the work by taking care of his creation. Genesis 1:27, 28. Joseph's whole life, including his hardships, demonstrated God at work. At the same time, Joseph's very work demonstrated God at work. Joseph worked hard, as we said before. He worked hard when he was taking care of Potiphar's household. He worked hard when he took care of the chief cupbearer and the chief baker. He worked hard when he oversaw the whole land of Egypt. Take a look at verses 40, 45, 46, 47, 48, 49. Joseph went throughout the whole land of Egypt. 46. 48. Joseph collected all the food produced in those 7 years of abundance in Egypt and stored it in the cities. In each city, he put the food grown in the fields surrounding it. He worked hard. Our work is connected to God's work. It must be. It should be. Joseph's new name, Zaphenath Paneah, means God who speaks and who lives. And that was the kind of life Joseph lived. After the 13 years of slavery and imprisonment, Joseph was suddenly promoted to the position of overseeing the whole land of Egypt. In this story, we recognize that it is more than just Joseph's story. In fact, it is God's story. It is God's story invading the life of Joseph. Joseph acknowledged it is not Joseph himself, but God who interprets dreams, who gives dreams. Moreover, Joseph sternly announced that it is not Pharaoh, but God who is in charge of Egypt. Joseph remained faithful. The splendor and the power of empire did not corrupt him. He knew who he was worshiping. Joseph lived a life that demonstrated God who speaks and who lives. We also are invited to recognize God's story in our stories, in others' stories. We too are invited to recognize that it is not I, but God. It is not even Pharaoh, but God who is in control. We too are invited to live a life of worship, a life of an unchanged faithfulness to God, even if we are led to the top of the world. Then, perhaps only then, can we live a life that demonstrates God who speaks and who lives. I'd like to invite the EP2 to come up. I would like for us to sing the song that we sang, the last of the 3 songs that we sang, Jesus at the center of my life. I'd like to invite you to stand with me to confess this song before the Lord. And I'd like to invite the servers of the communion to come, and Pastor Greg to come as we sing this song.